Giza, last resting place of three of the greatest pharaohs in Egyptian history. A wonder of the world. And home to a mystery. In a temple connected to the pyramid of the pharaoh Khafre, archaeologists discovered a huge and perfectly preserved statue of the king, carved in an exotic iridescent stone. But this sculpture is in no local rock. In fact, this striking material can only be found deep in the desert, hundreds of miles from Giza. So how did Khafre's people manage to bring this marvel here 4,000 years ago? To investigate this puzzle, Egypt detectives, archaeologist Miriam Cook and Egyptologist Dominic Montserrat search out the lost quarries of Khafre and undertake a unique experiment in ancient Egyptian engineering. The statue stares out at us across 4 millennia, a silent monument to the achievements of a lost civilization. It still inspires awe in those who come under its gaze, none more so than Egyptian antiquities chief Zahi Hawass.
Is one of the most beautiful statues ever made by a sculptor. It's really unique. I always say that he looks like a king because the sculptor put the royal blood in the statue, that you can feel that he's a king. When I look at the profile of that statue, I can really feel that the hawk is taking the king and flying with him up to the sky.
Made for a living god, the presence of this statue at Giza is also something of a miracle. It was carved from a single 3-ton block of gneiss, a rare stone not found anywhere close to the pyramid site. The question for the detectives is, where did this huge stone originally come from? And how did the Egyptians, with no modern technology, manage to get it here? The logical place to begin seems to be the valley temple where the statue was found. This is in itself an incredible feat of engineering. It is constructed of massive blocks of red granite, which, like the statue, also must have been carried great distances, as this rock isn't found locally. Perhaps finding the source of this could provide the first clue to the statue's origin. The detectives decide to split up. Dominic's expertise is best put to use researching ancient Egyptian technology. Miriam, meanwhile, heads south, down the Nile, to meet the archaeological team who are working on the puzzle of Khafre's quarries. Aswan, the southern edge of ancient Egypt. This has been identified as where Khafre found the massive red granite blocks to build his valley temple. Although Aswan is hundreds of miles from Giza, quarrying here was possible thanks to the Nile. When the blocks of stone had been cut from the cliffs and roughly shaped on site, they only had to be moved a short distance to the river, where they could be loaded onto barges, letting the water do the work of carrying them north to the pharaoh's court. Without the river, these quarries would never have existed, as the job of moving the cut stones more than a few hundred meters would have been impossible. But Aswan is not home to the rare gneiss of the statue. In fact, this rock doesn't occur anywhere on the banks of the Nile. In 1999, an international team of scientists came together to see if they could solve the riddle of the location of Khafre's missing quarry and discover how the pharaoh's builders actually brought the stone to Giza.
Many tools actually were found at our excavation.
Are these fairly typical, are they?
Yeah, I guess this is coming from Khafre Quarry, which famous kind of this tool.
For Miriam, finding the statue stone means a journey deep into Egypt's hostile western desert, to the place where team leader Ian Shaw believes they have rediscovered the lost quarry of Khafre. In the 1930s, a British Army patrol had taken a road into the western desert and got lost in a sandstorm. In their confusion, the patrol stumbled upon a mysterious place called Gebel El Aser. Scattered everywhere across the desert, they saw blocks of stone and countless stone tools. Nearly 4,500 years after Khafre's stonemasons had left there for the last time, the patrol had accidentally found his quarry. This was the source of his prized stone. Ian and the team have come to this desolate site many times, and by carefully removing centuries of sand, they have begun to uncover its secrets.
Well, here we are. This is what you've been looking for, the Khafre quarries.
It's an incredible place. And I recognise the stone. It's very distinctive, isn't it?
This is one of the spoil heaps that forms part of the whole quarry setup. And here I am standing on the spoil heap, which is a mixture of material which has been taken out from over here. And you can see lots of the blocks that they've begun to work that have come out of the ground over there. And down here, lots of lovely big fragments of precisely the kind of stone that the Khafre statue is made from.
But how could these discarded tools and fragments of stone in the desert be definitely linked to Khafre?
Well, this is impressive. It looks like these blocks have been specifically placed here.
What you have to imagine is that originally here between these two big slabs of the Khafre stone, there was a slab with the name of a ruler who sent an expedition here, and that ruler was Khufu.
This is the vital link. Khufu was Khafre's father, proving that the quarry was known and used during that dynasty. Perhaps it was even memories of the wonderful stone brought back by Khufu's expedition that inspired his son to commission his own extraordinary statue. But the Egypt detectives still have questions. Egyptians moved heavy stones by water, but this quarry is 35 miles from the nearest point on the Nile where it could be transferred to a barge for the journey to Giza. So how had they moved it? Miriam calls Dominic to see if his knowledge of Egyptian wall paintings might throw any light on how these engineering problems were solved.
I can think of one particular tomb that might be really helpful, but the thing is that the picture may be really damaged. I've heard that it's not in very good shape, so I don't know how far it'll get us.
Well, I think you should really go and have a look at it.
The problem is that it's up a really steep slope, so I'm not promising anything.
The tomb is at Deir el-Bersha, a necropolis over 100 miles south of Cairo. But Dominic isn't convinced he can even get there. A recent operation on his ankle makes him extremely anxious about his chances of success.
There are two things that I'm worried about. One is that the relief may no longer exist, and the second is that it's up a very, very steep mountainside, which I don't think I'm going to be able to get up.
It was going to be a tough climb, and there was no guarantee that there would be anything to see at the end of it.
Here it is. Things I do for Egyptology.
The tomb was made for an Egyptian governor who immortalized his glorious life on its walls. Old records show that the painting depicted how a huge statue had been moved. Dominic just has to hope that this ancient picture still survives.
It's quite hard to see in here in this dark tomb after the bright light out of the desert, but...
At first, it looks as if Dominic is out of luck.
These Coptic crosses don't look like very good news because it might mean that the painting's been vandalized. There's been a rockfall from the ceiling as well, which has left this great huge blank. And here it is. here it is, after all that. It's badly broken up by the rockfall, but you can see a massive statue being drawn along on a sledge. And it's being lubricated as it moves along by water being poured on it. And it's being pulled by these massed ranks of men, 3 deep, who are pulling on the ropes that are attached to the sled to move it along.
The wall painting suggests that there is no real mystery to moving huge stones. Egyptians simply put them on a sledge and used the brute force of a huge number of laborers to drag them along. It's time to call Miriam.
Hello?
Hey Miriam, it's Dominic.
Oh, Dominic, did you get into the tomb?
Yes, I did, and the relief is in really good shape.
What does it show about the movement of the blocks?
Well, they're put on sledges, wooden sledges, which are drawn along by teams of men on ropes. And to ease the movement of the sledges, the water is poured as a lubricant.
So do you think this is the answer? This is how they were getting the blocks out of the quarry?
Yep, I think that's the answer to how they move the blocks.
So is this the end of the trail for the Egypt detectives? Did Khafre get his stone by simply sending hundreds of men into the desert to drag it back for him?
They look as if they've just been freshly cut these stones down here, don't they?
Back at the quarry, however, the discovery of mysterious stone structures in the sand suggests the Egyptians had in fact been far more ingenious than anyone had imagined. Egypt detectives Dominic Montserrat and Miriam Cook are investigating the mystery of this statue of the pharaoh Khafre. It was carved from a block of very rare stone that came from a distant desert quarry. Usually the ancient Egyptians relied on barges on the Nile to transport such heavy blocks. But this quarry was deep in the western desert. So how did they move a 3-ton rock across 35 miles of scorching sand to reach the Nile? Dominic has found a tomb painting showing a huge statue being dragged by hundreds of men, suggesting brute force was the answer. If so, there should still be evidence at the quarry of this massive desert army. Miriam asks Ian Shaw if his team know how many people worked here 4,500 years ago.
I'm thinking about how these blocks were moved. And the image that comes to my mind is large numbers of men dragging these sledges with big blocks on top of them. How feasible is that here? Would it have worked?
It's not possible. There weren't large numbers of people at this site.
Ian's evidence comes from his work here amongst the low stone walls of what was once a workers' camp.
Well, we've got the remains here of some kind of oval encampment. So you can see the wall coming around here, and then the side of the slope. And the kind of numbers that you're talking about that would be needed to haul one of these great huge sledges along, they're just too many people to have housed in something like this. There just wasn't any kind of large settlement that you'd expect to be housing the kind of workforce that you'd need to pull one of these big sledges.
So something other than sheer force must have been used to move Khafre's stone. There were simply never enough people at the quarry here to do it in the way shown in the painting. The investigation seems to be going nowhere, stuck in the engulfing, smothering desert sand, a problem from which Khafre's enigmatic statue had somehow escaped. The team know the answer must lie in the quarry itself, if they can just put together all the clues. An obvious start would have been to make the blocks as light as possible, and the team's geologist, Tom Heldal, has shown that this is what happened. Instead of moving massive raw blocks, the Egyptians cut them down to a convenient statue size in situ. Sculptors called these blanks.
They were using hammer stones, like this one here. That's made of a slightly harder stone that they can use for carving the surface or hammering the surface to a smooth, to one plane. And this one is a whole one, but you're also, like this one, you can see have been used. It's broken in two and left in the quarry. So in this case, you can see this is a asymmetrical block that is quite flat on the bottom, and it's a thin edge, narrow edge here, and it's a bit fatter here. And that is actually fitting the shape of a sitting Pharaoh sculpture.
So this was the sort of size block Khafre had moved, but it was still far too large to simply drag. At Aswan, the answer had been water transport. So could that be the answer here? Was there once water in the desert? The archaeologist went back to the data for long-term climate change and made a remarkable discovery. Around 4,500 years ago, when the quarry was in use, North Africa was probably greener and seasonally wetter.
So the evidence that we have here...
And sure enough, team member Elizabeth Bloxham has found evidence that suggests there was once at least some water at the quarry.
Been focusing on this side of the research.
So Elizabeth, why do you think this is a well? Because it looks very similar to a small hut.
So if you look at the ground surface, you can see it's this very dark brown mud with very, very deep cracks here, indicating that it's a well and the water was coming up into these cracks.
And is it the same period as the Khafre quarries?
Yes, it is, because there are similar wells in the quarries, and one of them had an Old Kingdom pouring vessel in the base in a similar crack like this.
How does this particular well inform us about climate change, that it was a wetter environment here?
Simply because the water was so close to the surface, about 3 feet, so it indicates seasonally higher rainfall at the time.
Many other wells have now also come to light at the quarry, suggesting that water was available here 4,500 years ago. But you can't float a barge on underground water.
So we have water here, but we're still 35 miles from the Nile. Is there any river or channel that could have connected the two that might provide some kind of water transport?
Well, we do have the Wadi Tushka, which is just a short distance over there.
Today, the Wadi Tushka is a dry valley, but 4,500 years ago, in the rainy season, it could have filled up with water and provided Egyptian engineers with a connection to the Nile. But there is still a problem. The wadi is some distance from the quarry itself, so the ancient Egyptians had to first get the stone overland to the wadi and then somehow get the blocks onto the water. So could the answer lie in these puzzling structures back at the quarry itself?
Can you feel it?
These wedge-shaped ramps were built from the same stone used in the Pharaoh's statue, but with mysterious tracks at their base. The team are convinced these must hold the final clue.
That the environment was a lot wetter at that time and that water possibly played an important part in the transport of these blocks. But what is this, and how would this have fitted into the equation?
Well, basically we know that this is a type of stone ramp of the time of Khafre, and like most ramps, the basic idea seems to have been taking the big stone blocks that would eventually be statues up to the top here, and our initial assumption was that what they were trying to do was to get them onto some kind of conventional wooden sledge.
But then we excavated further and we realised how high the ramp is. A conventional low-lying sledge would only come up to this height, but we also have these very deep and wide tracks. So it seems that this was purpose-built for a vehicle that we don't know about in the archaeological record so far.
But purpose-built for what kind of vehicle, do you think?
Well, we know that the task that the Egyptians had was to get the stone from here to the Nile, to the river, and we know that the Khafre statue was found at Giza, and that therefore that was the ultimate destination of the statue blocks, 800 miles up to the north by river.
But they would also want to minimise the amount of times that they moved the block.
So what you're suggesting is a kind of amphibious vehicle?
That's certainly one possibility.
Moving the Pharaoh's stone by sledge would have been an almost impossible task. So the archaeologists believe that the ancient Egyptians may have come up with an ingenious engineering solution, an amphibious vehicle. This would only need to be loaded once and could then move the stone across both land and water. This sketch gives us an idea of how this remarkable vehicle might have looked. a simple, sturdy raft made buoyant with inflated animal skins. Underneath the raft were runners that allowed it to be precisely placed in front of the ramp. That's the reason for those mysterious tracks. Then it could be dragged, probably by animals, to the flooded Wadi Tushka, and from there floated down to the Nile. This theory is partly supported by this rare wall engraving that Elizabeth found. It depicts an ancient raft provided with additional buoyancy by animal skins filled with air, which could then bear the weight of these huge stone blocks. But were the archaeologists correct? The Egypt detectives returned to Aswan to put the theory to the test. Could such a craft have solved Khafre's transportation problem? In Aswan, they have commissioned a small-scale version of the craft from team member Adil Kalani. He and his colleagues use only the materials available to the ancient Egyptians, wooden planks, rope, and inflatable goat skins, to create one of these amazing amphibious barges. To test the theory properly, the model has to be precisely scaled and balanced.
What's the scale of this compared with the loading ramp and the tracks?
About a quarter of the size of the one that would have been used in conjunction with the loading ramps.
So these two pieces of wood here, are these the runners that would have gone into those ruts in front of the ramp?
Yes, exactly. They would fit into those tracks. Quite easy to hold it across.
As final preparations are made, it begins to look doubtful whether this apparently fragile craft will bear the weight of the stones they have prepared, exactly 1/4 of the original full-size load. There's only one way to find out. As the sun sets over the Nile, the craft is loaded, then prepared for launch. It's the first time the idea has been used in 4,500 years. Will it float? The answer is a surprising but triumphant yes. This may only have been a miniature version of a much grander original, but it proves that the principle works. Such a craft could have carried the rare stone from the quarry to the Wadi Tushka and then to the Nile for its final journey to Giza. Only then, after a 700-mile journey across sand and water, could that precious iridescent rock be transformed into the image of Khafre himself, granting immortality in stone to a man the Egyptians believed had been a god on earth.